Hello, book lovers. Welcome to the YouTube channel of Books and Culture. How nice to be able to talk to you again and to start a new literary project. I'm so excited to start this new adventure with you all. So, this is our first meeting, the first session of the guided reading of the book Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This is the third project of the same type that we do here at Books and Culture. First, the videos will be available on YouTube, and at a later date, you can also find the episodes, the sessions as podcast episodes in an overview of English literature. So you can decide which platform, which media you prefer best. So last year, in 2023, we read together and discussed. So this is the point of this sessions that I call guided reading sessions. It is because I am your guide in this literary adventure. So I am here to enrich your reading experience. So we're going to read all the chapters together, yes, but I'm going to stop every now and then, and I'm going to give you extra information, contextual information, which is very important. As we all know, my students at the Creative Reader Academy know how important it is to read a book in context, to go beyond the book pages, right? So that's what we'll do here. And I will also offer some analytical insights. So as a literature teacher, I have accumulated a lot of experience throughout the years. I've read a lot. So I'm here to offer you some of my own insights as I read this book, and you can compare them with your own. This is also part of one of the steps in the journey of a creative reader. By the way, if you're interested in developing your skills as a reader, becoming a really confident reader, and knowing how to have, in an independent, autonomous way, meaningful literary experiences, reading experiences, you have to be part of the Creative Reader Academy, the main course at Books and Culture. So where I offer you all the information you need to know from beginning to end for you to get the best out of your reading. So if you're interested in joining our academy, our fantastic academy of book lovers from all over the world, you can find more information on the website booksandculture.club. So why did I say that? Oh, yes, because I'm going to provide all this extra information for you here in these guided reading sessions. So last year we read together and discussed Jane Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility. Was great to talk to you a bit every week, right? And to build up that knowledge. Jane Austen is one of my favorite authors. So we began with Jane Austen, and at the time, I also offered a course on Jane Austen and her personal life, her literary career, her writing style, her novels published and unpublished, her early writing, her juvenilia, the critical reception of her work, the cult of Jane Austen. So all of this, all this knowledge I have piled up in the course, the Jane Austen Club. It's also available on Books and Culture website if you're interested in taking that course and to know more about Jane Austen. After that, this year in 2024, in the beginning of 2024, we read together Charlotte Bronte's The Professor. So the beginning of 2024 at Books and Culture, we began a literary cycle dedicated to Charlotte Brontë. So we were really studying Charlotte Bronte's oeuvre, her writing legacy. We did the guided reading sessions of The Professor, and in the course Exploring Jane Eyre, a journey in Victorian literature, a journey through Victorian literature. That course was live and it was offered in February and March. We really went deep in exploring, really analyzing all the layers. All the layers is impossible, but many layers of meanings in Jane Eyre. It's one of my favorite novels. So you see that we have been working with the Brontë sisters for a while. There was a workshop on Wuthering Heights also in 2023. So I am gathering material to create a course. There's a course in the making. If you want to know more about the Brontë sisters, the Brontë Sisters Club is coming up soon at Books and Culture. So it's nice that we're talking about Anne Brontë now, the third sister, the less known of the three, I would say. And if you're interested in digging deeper, hopefully by the end of this year, the course will be ready and you can join us then. So why Agnes Grey? So I opened up the question, what was it called? A question box on Instagram. And I asked you, what book would you like to read with me next in another series of guided reading sessions? And the winner of that poll was Agnes Grey, which made me really happy because I haven't read this book yet. So I'm going to discover it, explore it with you all as we go along. It's great material for us to continue studying the legacy of the Brontë sisters. So today, session 1, I'm going to give you an introduction to the novel and the time period and to Anne Brontë. And we're going to read together and discuss chapter 1. After that, every Friday, there is a new video on YouTube. So you will find the video there at 9 o'clock in the morning. Every Friday, 9 o'clock, you will find a new video and you will be able to watch it as you go to work, as you go to class, or later on in the day or another day. So you have the flexibility to watch it whenever is more convenient for you. And each week we're going to read 2 chapters. You can find the whole schedule on our Instagram at books.and.culture. And if you ask me what edition should I use, any edition, I'm going to refer to chapter numbers. So those are also in any edition. I'm not going to refer to page numbers. This book is in the public domain, so it was published in 1847, so you can find it very easily for free on the internet. Project Gutenberg, for instance. I like to have my physical copy. Members of the Creative Reader Academy know and learn how to annotate a book. So I really like the physicality, the materiality of the book, and to annotate, add my thoughts on the side, on the margins. My edition is from the Modern Library Classics. I was quite surprised to see that there aren't many editions, many good editions of Agnes Grey, not as many as Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, for instance. So it's definitely a less known work. I like editions that come with an introduction and with notes. That's why I chose this one, because it contains introduction and notes by Barbara Suez, and she's assistant professor of English at William Paterson University. So I find that very important. That's why I always tell my students, if you want to dig deep, to purchase an academic edition. And an academic edition contains introduction, all this paratextual material, right? Introduction, notes, etc. And the introduction, so here we have an introduction to Anne Brontë that I will read together with you because it offers very nice information for us to prepare ourselves and to know more about the context of production and publication and the reception of the book and her life. There is a longer text here, Cultural Critique and the Imperative of Experiencing Agnes Grey, which is very interesting. But I recommend reading this at the end if you want to avoid spoilers. So after we complete our journey, if you're interested, I can record an extra class, an extra session discussing this introduction with you all. So let me know in the comments if this is something you would like. Speaking of that, if you haven't yet done so, please like this video, leave a comment, share it, subscribe to the channel, so that that really motivates me to keep going, to know that I am making an impact, a positive impact on the lives of book lovers. So that will make me really, really happy. All right, so let's begin with a note on Anne Brontë. The Brontë sisters are, of course, significant, essential names in the history of English literature, especially Victorian literature. That's our expertise here at Books and Culture. So let's know a little bit more about her life. Normally, the others outshine her. So Charlotte Brontë and her Jane Eyre, and Emily and her Wuthering Heights. So in comparison, Anne's work has been overshadowed. But she's a very interesting figure nonetheless, and we're going to talk about her specifically. So Anne Brontë was born at Thornton, Yorkshire on January 17th, 1820. She was the sixth and youngest child of Reverend Patrick Brontë, an Irishman by birth, and Maria Branwell Brontë, who was from a prosperous Cornish family. Now you may wonder, the sixth child, but aren't they three sisters and the brother Patrick Branwell? Yes, but what a lot of people do not know, their whole family history is quite tragic. I talk about it in detail in the lesson about Jane Eyre and introducing Hawthorne and where they lived. They had two older sisters, but those two died at a very young age, 10 and 12, if I'm not mistaken, when they were sent to a boarding school, which was very normal at the time. But the conditions in some of these schools were terrible. And they would be separate from their parents, and their parents would normally not even know what was going on in there. And there was an outburst of tuberculosis, and a lot of the children died there very quickly. So the parents received, they were called Maria and Elizabeth, if I'm not mistaken. So they were there, and they were very ill, and the directress sent a letter to the parents. So the mother, Mrs. Brontë, and her aunt went there to the school, but it was too late. The two girls died, and what is also not what's worse, but what makes it worse, the aunt also got infected and later died. So it's that sadness, the absence of those two older sisters, and what they suffered in the negligence they suffered in an educational place, right? This boarding school also affected very much the way Emily, Anne, and Charlotte wrote. Following her mother's death in 1821, Anne and four sisters and one brother were raised by an aunt, Elizabeth Branwell. The two eldest daughters, Maria and Elizabeth, indeed, died in 1825 from tuberculosis contracted at the religious boarding school to which they had been sent. Anne spent her childhood and formative years in the isolated parsonage at Haworth, Yorkshire, where her father was curate. And if you want, that's still in my bucket list. If you want to visit the Brontes' house, the museum nowadays, and to see the marshes, that's something I would really like to experience. If you've read Wuthering Heights, you know what I'm talking about. So all that barren landscape that really affected Heathcliff and Catherine. So I would love to go there. That's in Haworth in Yorkshire. The Brontë children all thrived in fantasy worlds that drew on their voracious reading of Byron, Scott, and Shakespeare, as well as the Arabian Nights and Gothic fiction. Their father had a lot of books at home, so they were privileged in that sense that they had access to books, and they read a lot. They were very isolated in terms of society. They did not see other people very often, but they connected with the world through books. And they expressed themselves. They found a way to express themselves by creating fantasy worlds. And there is one lesson in the course about the Brontë sisters in which I talk about these two worlds, Gondal and the kingdom of Angria. So they created these fantasy worlds, and they would write stories set in them. They would create all the characters and the connection between the characters. So writers from a very early age. So Anne and Emily, the two youngest, worked together on a saga about the fictitious island of Gondal, while Charlotte and brother Branwell, the oldest, wrote melodramatic chronicles centered on the imaginary kingdom of Angria. In 1836, Anne entered Miss Wooler's school at Rule Head, Charlotte and Emily's alma mater, but withdrew the next year because of illness. Illness was very constant in that area. And if you want to know why, you need to take the course on the Brontë sisters. I talk about that, and it is quite appalling why that place in particular had such a high mortality rate, and why the age expectancy was really low, around 20 something years. So people would die very early, and a lot of deaths. Want to know the reason? Take that class in the upcoming course about the Brontë sisters. Okay. Financial considerations forced Anne to seek employment as a governess. The governess is a very significant figure in all of the three girls' writing, in her stories, in their stories, in their imagination. They all had the experience of being governesses, and we talk about it when in the lesson discussing Jane Eyre, how the governess is this in-between figure, socially speaking. She is not in a house, she's not part of the family, but she's also not as low as the other servants. So she's in this in-between, quite an invisible figure, and very lonely, right? And the three of them really explore what it was to be a governess in Victorian England, and especially because as girls from a middle class family, if they were in need of in financial need, there were very few choices for them. The first one, as Jane Austen has very extensively written about, is marriage. So you had to get married to find someone to support you, right? Your husband. So you would have a house, a family, etc. You would have a very concrete and clear social role. But if you were not married and you needed money, and you didn't have a family to back you up, or the family did not have enough means to support all the children, and I'm talking about girls specifically, then what would be considered appropriate and respectful was a role of governess. So above the roles of maid servants, ladies' maids, etc. So that would still be considered respectable enough for girls coming from middle-class families, for instance. So she was forced to seek employment as a governess. In 1839, she arrived at Blake Hall in Mirfield to tutor the children of Joshua Ingham, a local squire and magistrate. From 1840 to 1845, she was governess at Thorpe Green, the home of Reverend Edmund Robinson, located 12 miles from York. In 1843, Branwell Brontë also found work as a tutor at Thorpe Green, the brother, until suspicions of an illicit relationship with his employer's wife resulted in dismissal. Branwell's gradual descent into alcoholism, drug addiction, and madness is reflected in the writings of all three sisters, particularly in The Tenant of Wadville Hall. The Tenant of Wadville Hall was also written by Anne Brontë. So Patrick, he was the only boy amongst the girls. He also had creative aspirations. He wanted to be a painter, then he wanted to be a poet, but he was never as successful as the girls, and nothing he did would thrive. So that only led him into more and more addiction, opium addiction, etc., alcohol addiction, and he would just slowly deteriorate in front of their sister's eyes. And that was, I'm sure, very painful. And the terrible effects of alcohol is explored by Anne in The Tenant of Whitehall Hall. If you haven't read that novel, I highly recommend it as well. The Brontes launched their literary careers in 1846 with a collection of verse published pseudonymously with pseudonyms as Poems by Kerr, Alice, and Acton Bell. So we talk about the pseudonyms and the history of publication in the course, but they chose these 3 pseudonyms, male pseudonyms. So Kerr Bell was Charlotte Brontë, so they kept the initials CB. Alice Bell was Emily Brontë, and Acton Bell was Anne Brontë. So they published their collection of poems under these pseudonyms. And guess what? I don't remember exactly the number, but very few editions sold of this first collection of poems. Very few, like less than 10, for you to have an idea. So I tell my students, never give up. Imagine if they had given up on writing when that first publication was a commercial failure, not aesthetic failure, but a commercial failure. They continued writing, but then they switched to prose. In 1847, Anne's first novel, Agnes Grey, was published in a volume together with Emily's Wuthering Heights. So it was a book in 3 volumes. Volumes 1 and 2 were the different parts of Wuthering Heights, and volume 3 was Agnes Grey. Based on Anne's experiences as a governess, it exposed desperate plight of unmarried, educated women driven to take up the only respectable career open to them. Though the critic George Moore, perhaps Anne's greatest champion, later deemed it the most, and I quote, the most perfect prose narrative in English literature, end of quote, the work was overshadowed by the intense originality of Wuthering Heights, not to mention the enormous success of Charlotte's Jane Eyre, which had appeared a few weeks earlier. Yeah, you see this quote here on the blurb. George Moore, the one story in English literature in which style, characters, and subject are in perfect keeping. And not only that, but what did he say? The most perfect prose narrative in English literature. So that's quite a feat. Anne continued writing. Her second novel, The Tenant of Whitehall Hall, came out in 1848, so a year later. The bold story of a strong-minded woman's struggle for independence, the book unmasked the dark brutality of Victorian chauvinism, but was nevertheless attacked by some critics as a celebration of the very excesses it criticized. It's quite a dark novel, so it was considered a scandal that it had been written by a woman, although it was only later found out that these 3, Acton, Kerr, and Alice, were women. The identity of the Brontë sisters was only revealed when Charlotte Brontë wrote the biographical notice in a new edition of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey in 1850, after the deaths of her sisters. Charlotte Brontë, as she later revealed in the biographical notice of Alice and Acton Bell in 1850, was specially disturbed by it. So even Charlotte, her sister, was disturbed by the book, The Tenant of Whitehall Hall. And I quote, "The choice of subject was an entire mistake. Nothing less congruous with the writer's nature could be conceived. The motives which dictated this choice were pure, but I think slightly morbid." End of quote. They were all a bit morbid, the 3 of them. And no wonder, with all the death that surrounded them as kids and growing up. The Tenant of Whitehall Hall reminded other reviewers of Wuthering Heights, and it quickly went to a second printing. Quote, "Every reader who has felt the power of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights comes sooner or later to The Tenant of Whitehall Hall," end quote, wrote Brontë scholar Margaret Lane. Anne Brontë, with all the Brontë taste for violence and drama, and with her experience of the same rude scenes and savage Yorkshire tales that had fed the imaginations of her sisters, did not shrink. She used the material at hand and shaped it with singular honesty and seriousness. One discovers from Marfell Hall that Anne is a true Brontë. The final months of Anne Bronte's life were filled with tragedy. Both Branwell and Emily died of tuberculosis in the autumn of 1848. So in 1848, the brother and the sister Emily died. The following year, Anne succumbed to the same illness at Scarborough on May 28, 1849, at the age of 29 years old, only very young. Same age as Percy Shelley when he died, but that was decades before. But all these great minds and creative minds that died so young. So imagine Charlotte. She lost the brother and the two sisters in less than a year. She was the only one left. So this is the introduction to Agnes Grey and to the whole Brontë family. And I hope you are excited to embark on this journey and that this has sparked your interest, your curiosity in knowing more about this book. So now we're going to read together chapter 1. In total, there are 25 chapters. Today we're going to read chapter 1. And chapter 1 is called The Parsonage. You will, now that you know the story or the history of Anne's life and her family, you will notice a lot of biographical commonalities, similarities, allusions. Of course, this is fiction, right? But there is a lot of her own experience. There always is. A writer cannot erase their own personality, but you will see a lot of these echoes of her own life. That's how it begins. Chapter 1, The Parsonage. All true histories contain instruction, though in some the treasure may be hard to find, and when found, so trivial in quantity that the dry, shriveled kernel scarcely compensates for the trouble of cracking the nut. Whether this be the case with my history or not, I am hardly competent to judge. I sometimes think it might prove useful to some and entertaining to others, but the world may judge for itself. Shielded by my own obscurity and by the lapse of years and a few fictitious names, I do not fear to venture, and will candidly lay before the public what I would not disclose to the most intimate friend. With this first paragraph, there's a lot we can say already. First of all, it is a first-person narrative, right? Whether this be the case with my history or not, I am hardly competent to judge. So the first person I is talking. So the narrator is a character, right? But the lapse of years, so we know that it's an older narrator looking back at this period of her life. And it's a history that is so intimate that she would not disclose it to the most intimate friend, but she's doing it now after the lapse of years and with the help of fictitious names. So it definitely catches your curiosity, right? What has happened to her? We know it's or what has happened to them at this point. We don't know purely from the text if the narrator is a man or a woman. So their story, what happened, right? And why would they not want to tell it, not even to a close friend, right? So let's keep going. My father was a clergyman of the north of England, who was deservedly respected by all who knew him, and in his younger days lived pretty comfortably on the joint income of a small incumbency and a snug little property of his own. My mother, who married him against the wishes of her friends, was a squire's daughter, and a woman of spirit. In vain it was represented to her that if she became the poor parson's wife, she must relinquish her carriage and her lady's maid, and all the luxuries and elegancies of affluence, which to her were little less than the necessaries of life. A carriage and a lady's maid were great conveniences, but thank heaven she had feet to carry her and hands to minister to her own necessities. An elegant house and spacious grounds were not to be despised, but she would rather live in a cottage with Richard Grey than in a palace with any other man in the world. So now we know more about the narrator's upbringing, her roots, let's say. So her father was a reverend, much like Anne's own father. And her mom had come from an affluent family, but when she decided to marry the poor parson, she lost all the access she had had to luxurious to a luxurious lifestyle, such as a carriage, a lady's maid. But it was a love match, you can see here, because she would happily give up all those luxuries if she could have the love of Richard Grey, the father of Agnes, right? Finding arguments of no avail, her father, this is her mother's father, right? At length told the lovers that they might marry if they pleased, but in so doing, his daughter would forfeit every fraction of her fortune. He expected this would cool the ardor of both, but he was mistaken. My father knew too well my mother's superior worth not to be sensible that she was a valuable fortune in herself. And if she would but consent to embellish his humble hearth, he should be happy to take her on any terms, while she, on her part, would rather labor with her own hands than be divided from the man she loved, whose happiness it would be her joy to make, and who was already one with her in heart and soul. So her fortune went to swell the purse of a wiser sister, who had married a rich nabob. And then the importance of an academic edition, because here we have a footnote. So what does nabob mean? We take a look here. A man who gained his wealth and prominence in British colonized India. So we are at the time here. So it's the middle of the 19th century. It's the peak of the British Empire, or almost the peak of the British Empire, with all their colonies all over the world, in fact, and India was a big one. So someone who had made their worth not by being born in an affluent family, in landed aristocracy, but by making money in colonial pursuits in India, right? So the other sister married a nabob and got all the part of the money that would have been given to Agnes' mother if she had not married Agnes' father. And she, to the wonder and compassionate regret of all who knew her, went to bury herself in the homely village parsonage among the hills of Stripes. I'll go back to it. And yet, in spite of all this, and in spite of my mother's high spirit and my father's whims, I believe you might search all England through and fail to find a happier couple. I don't know if you can see it here, but you see here the names of places in the Brontë sisters' works. The places are never mentioned. Some are more general places or fictional places, like Wuthering Heights. But for instance, here the hills of, there's just an underline. Here the note says, the use of the long evasive dash in place of actual names or places was common practice in 19th century novels, especially those like this one, purporting to be true histories. Right? It's fiction, but the narrator promises, right? It's of course plays with the reader's expectations, promises it's true narrative. So the dash is meant to represent the narrator's discretion and can be compared to our use in contemporary media of the legal disclaimer, names were changed to protect the innocent. So in order to keep it all secret, and so then the real people about whom the story is would not be identified, right? So this long dash instead of the names of the real names of the places. Of 6 children, my sister Mary and myself were the only 2 that survived the perils of infancy and early childhood. So that's quite interesting. Remember what I told you before? that out of the 6 children of the Bronte family, 2 died, Maria and Elizabeth, right? And here, out of the 6 children, only 2 survived, and Agnes and Mary. And Mary, very similar name to Maria, the name of the sister that died. So you see here all this echoes, all these echoes. I, being the younger by 5 or 6 years, was always regarded as the child and the pet of the family. Father, mother, and sister all combined to spoil me, not by foolish indulgence to render me fractious and ungovernable, but by ceaseless kindness to make me too helpless and dependent, too unfit for buffeting with the cares and turmoils of life. Mary and I were brought up in the strictest seclusion. My mother, being at once highly accomplished, well-informed, and fond of employment, took the whole charge of our education on herself, with the exception of Latin, which my father undertook to teach us, so that we never even went to school. Here there is a footnote. Although they spent some time at schools away from home, the Bronte girls were educated in large part at home. Anne was tutored primarily by her aunt Branwell, who lived with the Brontes after their mother died in 1821 when Anne was a baby. So Anne never really had the chance to connect with her mother. She was just a baby when her mother died. Another absence, right? So the Bronte sisters were also very secluded, much like the 2 girls here, the Grey family. And as there was no society in the neighborhood, our only intercourse with the world consisted in a stately tea party now and then with the principal farmers and tradespeople of the vicinity, just to avoid being stigmatized as too proud to consort with our neighbors, and an annual visit to our paternal grandfathers, where himself, our kind grandmamma, a maiden aunt, and 2 or 3 elderly ladies and gentlemen were the only persons we ever saw. Another footnote here. I love those. Really enrich our experience, right? So there was no society. They didn't see many people except for these 2 events in a year. Compared to Charlotte Bronte's description of the Bronte childhood in Biographical Notice of Alice and Acton Bell. So this is what Charlotte wrote about their upbringing. Resident in a remote district where education had made little progress and where consequently there was no inducement to seek social intercourse beyond our own domestic circle, we were wholly dependent on ourselves and each other's, on books and study for the enjoyments and occupations of life. So there are a lot of similarities here, right, between the Bronte and the Greys. So what kept them company was employment, intellectual employment, books, and study, right? And that's it, sorry. Sometimes our mother would amuse us with stories and anecdotes of her younger days, and her mother had probably experienced much more coming from an affluent family, so she would have been part of social activities, would have seen a lot of people, so she would have probably interesting stories to tell, which, while they entertained us amazingly, frequently awoke, in me at least, a vague and secret wish to see a little more of the world. I thought she must have been very happy, but she never seemed to regret past times. My father, however, whose temper was neither tranquil nor cheerful by nature, often unduly vexed himself with thinking of the sacrifices his dear wife had made for him, and troubled his head with revolving endless schemes for the augmentation of his little fortune for her sake and for ours. In vain, my mother assured him she was quite satisfied, and if he would but lay by a little for the children, we should all have plenty, both for time present and to come. But saving was not my father's forte. He would not run in debt, at least my mother took good care he should not. But while he had money, he must spend it. He liked to see his house comfortable and his wife and daughters well clothed and well attended. And besides, he was charitably disposed and liked to give to the poor according to his means, or, as some might think, beyond them. At length, however, a kind friend suggested to him a means of doubling his private property at one stroke, and further increasing it hereafter to an untold amount. This friend was a merchant, a man of enterprising spirit and undoubted talent, who was somewhat straitened in his mercantile pursuits for want of capital, but generously proposed to give my father a fair share of his profits, if he would only entrust him with what he could spare, and he thought he might safely promise that whatever sum the latter chose to put into his hands, it should bring him in cent per cent. The small patrimony was speedily sold, and the whole of its price was deposited in the hands of the friendly merchant, who as promptly proceeded to ship his cargo and prepare for his voyage. My father was delighted, so were we all, with our brightening prospects. For the present, it is true, we were reduced to the narrow income of the curacy, but my father seemed to think there was no necessity for scrupulously restricting our expenditure to that. So, with a standing bill at Mr. Jackson's, another at Smith's, and a third at Hobson's, we got along even more comfortably than before, though my mother affirmed we had better keep within bounds, for our prospects of wealth were but precarious after all, and if my father would only trust everything to her management, he should never feel himself stint. But he, for once, was incorrigible. Here, a standing bill means an account. So they would buy stuff but not pay yet, because they were quite sure of this money that was sure to come, right? What happy hours Mary and I have passed while sitting at our work by the fire, or wandering on the heath-clad hills, or idling under the weeping birch, the only considerable tree in the garden, talking of future happiness to ourselves and our parents, of what we would do and see and possess, with no firmer foundation for our goodly superstructure than the riches that were expected to flow in upon us from the success of the worthy merchant's speculations. Our father was nearly as bad as ourselves, only that he affected not to be so much in earnest, expressing his bright hopes and sanguine expectations in jests and playful sallies that always struck me as being exceedingly witty and pleasant. Our mother laughed with delight to see him so hopeful and happy, but still she feared he was setting his heart too much upon the matter, and once I heard her whisper as she left the room, "God grant he be not disappointed. I know not how he would bear it." Disappointed he was, and bitterly too. It came like a thunderclap on us all that the vessel which contained our fortune had been wrecked and gone to the bottom with all its stores, together with several of the crew and the unfortunate merchant himself. I was grieved for him. I was grieved for the overthrow of all our air-built castles. But with the elasticity of youth, I soon recovered the shock. Though riches and charms, poverty had no terrors for an experienced girl like me. Indeed, to say the truth, there was something exhilarating in the idea of being driven to straits and thrown upon our own resources. And here there's a footnote. Interestingly, Charles Bronte's Jane Eyre provides an alternative reading of poverty. So here, for someone who has never experienced poverty for real, but perhaps read about it and idealized fairy tale stories from poverty to happily ever after, right? The girl did not really feel the magnitude of what was to come. But there's a different reading of poverty in Jane Eyre. In chapter 3, the title character reflects, "Poverty looks grim to grown people, still more so to children. They have not much idea of industrious, working, respectable poverty. They think of the word only as connected with ragged clothes, scanty food, fireless grates, rude manners, and debasing vices. Poverty for me was synonymous with degradation." So Jane Eyre was more worried about the moral consequences of poverty, while Agnes Grey here, she's not really concerned yet, but she will with the material consequences of poverty. Let's see where we were. Yes. I only wished Papa, Mamma, and Mary were all of the same mind as myself. And then, instead of lamenting past calamities, we might all cheerfully set to work to remedy them. And the greater the difficulties, the harder our present privations. The greater should be our cheerfulness to endure the latter, and our vigor to contend against the former. Mary did not lament, but she brooded continually over the misfortune and sank into a state of dejection from which no effort of mine could rouse her. I could not possibly bring her to regard the matter on its bright side as I did. And indeed, I was so fearful of being charged with childish frivolity or stupid insensibility that I carefully kept most of my bright ideas and cheery notions to myself, well knowing they could not be appreciated. My mother thought only of consoling my father and paying our debts and retrenching our expenditure by every available means. But my father was completely overwhelmed by the calamity. Health, strength, and spirits sunk beneath the blow, and he never wholly recovered them. In vain my mother strove to cheer him up by appealing to his piety, to his courage, to his affection for herself and us. That very affection was his greatest torment. It was for our sakes he had so ardently longed to increase his fortune. It was our interest that had lent such brightness to his hopes, and that imparted such bitterness to his present distress. He now tormented himself with remorse at having neglected my mother's advice, which would at least have saved him from the additional burden of debt. He vainly reproached himself for having brought her from the dignity, the ease, the luxury of her former station to toil with him through the cares and toils of poverty. It was gall and wormwood to his soul to see that splendid, highly accomplished woman, once so courted and admired, transformed into an active managing housewife, with hands and head continually occupied with household labors and household economy. The very willingness with which she performed these duties, the cheerfulness with which she bore her reverses, and the kindness with which withheld her from imputing the smallest blame to him, were all perverted by this ingenious self-tormentor into further aggravations of his sufferings. And thus the mind preyed upon the body, and disordered the system of the nerves, and they in turn increased the troubles of the mind, till by action and reaction his health was seriously impaired, and not one of us could convince him that the aspect of our affairs was not half so gloomy, so utterly hopeless as his morbid imagination represented it to be. The useful pony phaeton was sold. That's an open carriage. So quite a luxury. So the useful pony phaeton was sold, together with a stout, well-fed pony, the old favorite that we had fully determined should end its days in peace and never pass from our hands. The little coach house and stable were let, the servant boy and the more efficient, being the more expensive, of the two maid servants were dismissed. Our clothes were mended, turned, and darned to the utmost verge of decency. Our food, always plain, was now simplified to an unprecedented degree, except my father's favorite dishes. Our coals and candles were painfully economized. The pair of candles reduced to one, and that most sparingly used. The coals carefully husbanded in the half-empty grate, especially when my father was out on his parish duties or confined to bed through illness. Then we sat with our feet on the fender, scraping the perishing embers together from time to time, and occasionally adding a slight scattering of the dust and fragments of coal, just to keep them alive. As for our carpets, they in time were worn threadbare, and patched and darned even to a greater extent than our garments. To save the expense of a gardener, Mary and I undertook to keep the garden in order, and all the cooking and household work that could not easily be managed by one servant girl was done by my mother and sister, with a little occasional help from me. Only a little, because though a woman in my own estimation, I was still a child in theirs, and my mother, like most active managing women, was not gifted with very active daughters. For this reason, that being so clever and diligent herself, she was never tempted to trust her affairs to a deputy, but on the contrary, was willing to act and think for others as well as for number one. And whatever was the business in hand, she was apt to think that no one could do it so well as herself, so that whenever I offered to assist her, I received such an answer as, No, love, you cannot. Indeed, there's nothing here you can do. Go and help your sister, or get her to take a walk with you. Tell her she must not sit so much, and stay so constantly in the house as she does. She may well look thin and dejected. Mary, Mamma says I'm to help you, or get you to take a walk with me. She says you may well look thin and dejected if you sit so constantly in the house. Help me you cannot, Agnes, and I cannot go out with you. I have far too much to do. Then let me help you. You cannot indeed, dear child. Go and practice your music, or play with the kitten. There was always plenty of sewing on hand, but I had not been taught to cut out a single garment. And except plain hemming and seaming, there was little I could do, even in that line, for they both asserted that it was far easier to do the work themselves than to prepare it for me. And besides, they liked better to see me prosecuting my studies or amusing myself. It was time enough for me to sit bending over my work like a grave matron, when my favorite little pussy was become a steady old cat. Under such circumstances, although I was not many degrees more useful than the kitten, my idleness was not entirely without excuse. So she was spoiled by her family, father, mother, sister. She didn't learn how to do much, and so she could not help, theoretically. So that is quite bad for her, right? Because when she has to fend for herself, when she has to find a way to make a living for herself, that's going to be very problematic, the fact that she doesn't have any skills. Through all our troubles, I never but once heard my mother complain of our want of money. As summer was coming on, she observed to Mary and me, "What a desirable thing it would be for your papa to spend a few weeks at a watering place. I am convinced the sea air and the change of scene would be of incalculable service to him. But then you see, there's no money," she added with a sigh. Now, if you're wondering what a watering place is, one of many resort towns, including Bath and Scarborough, where people went to take the waters, which means to drink and bathe in the local water, which was said to cure people of various ailments. Popular holiday destinations, watering places also became known as places to see and to be seen and to make important social connections. Bronte spent some time in Scarborough, where she was eventually buried, trying to recover from her illness. And you see that in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, right? Bath was a very popular watering place, so people would go there to take in the waters. But also, since it was such a popular, fashionable place, people would go there during the season, the summer, to see and be seen, right? We both wished exceedingly that the thing might be done, and lamented greatly that it could not. "Well, well," said she, "it's no use complaining. Possibly something might be done to further the project after all. Mary, you are a beautiful drawer. What do you say to doing a few more pictures in your best style and getting them framed with the watercolor drawings you have already done, and trying to dispose of them to some liberal picture dealer who has the sense to discern their merits?" "Mamma, I should be delighted if you think they could be sold, and for anything worthwhile." Now here there's a footnote that the mother says to sell the paintings, the drawings made by the daughter. For an insightful fictional portrayal of the difficulties a 19th century woman would have had in attempting to make her living in this way, see Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. There's also a female character who paints, and she tries to make a living out of selling her paintings, but it is very difficult. Also, it would not be considered appropriate for a woman in high society to sell things, right? So it was very hard for a woman to make a living on her own at that time. But they would be willing here, the Grey girls and the mother would be willing to do that. "It's worthwhile trying, however, my dear. Do you procure the drawings, and I'll endeavor to find a purchaser." "I wish I could do something," said I. "You, Agnes? Well, who knows? You draw pretty well, too. If you choose some simple pieces for your subject, I dare say you will be able to produce something we shall all be proud to exhibit. But I have another scheme in my head, Mamma, and have had long, only I did not like to mention it. Indeed, pray tell us what it is. I should like to be a governess. My mother uttered an exclamation of surprise and laughed. My sister dropped her work in astonishment, exclaiming, "You, a governess, Agnes, what can you be dreaming of?" Well, I don't see anything so very extraordinary in it. I do not pretend to be able to instruct great girls, but surely I could teach little ones. And I should like it so much. I am so fond of children. Do let me, Mamma. But my love, you have not learned to take care of yourself yet, and young children require more judgment and experience to manage than older ones. But, Mamma, I am above 18 and quite able to take care of myself and others too. You do not know half the wisdom and prudence I possess because I have never been tried. Only think, said Mary, what would you do in a house full of strangers without me or Mamma to speak and act for you, with a parcel of children besides yourself to attend to, and no one to look to for advice? You would not even know what clothes to put on. You think, because I always do as you bid me, I have no judgment of my own, but only try me. This is all I ask, and you shall see what I can do. At that moment my father entered, and the subject of our discussion was explained to him. "What, my little Agnes, a governess?" cried he, and in spite of his dejection he laughed at the idea. "Yes, papa, don't you say anything against it. I should like it so much, and I'm sure I could manage delightfully." "But, my darling, we could not spare you." And a tear glistened in his eye as he added, "No, no. Afflicted as we are, surely we are not brought to that pass yet." "Oh, no," said my mother, "there is no necessity whatever for such a step. It is merely a whim of her own, so you must hold your tongue, you naughty girl, for though you are so ready to leave us, you know very well we cannot part with you." I was silenced for that day and for many succeeding ones, but still I did not wholly relinquish my darling scheme. Mary got her drawing materials and steadily set to work. I got mine too, but while I drew, I thought of other things. How delightful it would be a governess, to go out into the world, to enter upon a new life, to act for myself, to exercise my unused faculties, to try my unknown powers, to earn my own maintenance, and something to comfort and help my father, mother, and sister, besides exonerating them from the provision of my food and clothing. To show papa what his little Agnes could do, to convince Mamma and Mary that I was not quite the helpless, thoughtless being they supposed. And then how charming to be entrusted with the care and education of children. Whatever others say, I felt I was fully competent to the task. The clear remembrance of my own thoughts and feelings in early childhood would be a surer guide than the instructions of the most mature adviser. I had but to turn from my little pupils to myself at their age, and I should know at once how to win their confidence and affections, how to waken the contrition of the erring, how to embolden the timid and console the afflicted, how to make virtue predictable, instruction desirable, and religion lovely and comprehensible. And here is a quote from a poem. "Delightful task to teach the young idea how to shoot." If we look at the footnote, this is from The Seasons by Scottish poet James Thomson. So she quotes in her mind from this poem, "Delightful task to teach the young idea how to shoot. To train the tender plants and watch their buds unfolding day by day. Influenced by so many inducements, I determined still to persevere, though the fear of displeasing my mother or distressing my father's feelings prevented me from resuming the subject for several days. At length, again, I mentioned it to my mother in private, and with some difficulty got her to promise to assist me with her endeavors. My father's reluctant consent was next obtained, and then, though Mary still sighed her disapproval, my dear kind mother began to look out for a situation for me. She wrote to my father's relations and consulted the newspaper advertisements. Her own relations she had long dropped all communication with. A formal interchange of occasional letters was all she had ever had since her marriage, and she would not at any time have applied to them in a case of this nature. But so long and so entire had been my parents' seclusion from the world that many weeks elapsed before a suitable situation could be procured. At last, to my great joy, it was declared that I should take charge of the young family of a certain Mrs. Bloomfield, whom my kind, prim Aunt Grey had known in her youth, and asserted to be a very nice woman. Her husband was a retired tradesman who had realized a very comfortable fortune, but could not be prevailed upon to give a greater salary than £25 to the instructress of his children. I, however, was glad to accept this, rather than refuse the situation, which my parents were inclined to think the better plan. Here there's a footnote on Mrs. Bloomfield, so the first house that Agnes goes to. Anne Brontë worked as a governess for the Inghams of Blake Hall in 1839. Scholars generally agree that the Bloomfields are based, at least in part, on her experiences with the Inghams. So again, all the autobiographical echoes. So her experience as a governess for the Inghams definitely affects how she paints Agnes' experience with the Bloomfields. But some weeks more were yet to be devoted to preparation. How long, how tedious those weeks appeared to me, yet they were happy ones in the main, full of bright hopes and ardent expectations. With what peculiar pleasure I assisted at the making of my new clothes and subsequently the packing of my trunks. But there was a feeling of bitterness mingling with the latter occupation too, and when it was done, when all was ready for my departure on the morrow, and the last night at home approached, a sudden anguish seemed to swell my heart. My dear friends looked so sad and spoke so very kindly that I could scarcely keep my eyes from overflowing. But I still affected to be gay. I had taken my last ramble with Mary on the moors, my last walk in the garden and round the house. I had fed with her our pet pigeons for the last time, the pretty creatures that we had tamed to peck their backs as they crowded in my lap. I had tenderly kissed my own peculiar favorites, the pair of snow-white fantails. I had played my last tune on the old familiar piano and sung my last song to Papa. Not the last, I hoped, but the last for what appeared to me a very long time. And perhaps when I did these things again, it would be with different feelings. Circumstances might be changed, and this house might never be my settled home again. Now, this is something we can perhaps all relate to at a certain phase in our lives. When we leave home, regardless if it's in the middle of the 19th century or the 21st century. So the excitement about doing something new, seeing the world, especially for Agnes, who had been secluded for so long, she had this urge to see the world, to experience more. But at the same time, there's this anguish of leaving home, the fear that when and if she returned to that house, it would not be her home again. Circumstances would have changed. It's indeed a farewell to childhood, and it is really, really exciting and painful at the same time. My dear little friend, the kitten, would certainly be changed. She was already growing a fine cat, and when I returned, even for a hasty visit at Christmas, would most likely have forgotten both her playmate and her merry pranks. I had romped with her for the last time, and when I stroked her soft, bright fur while she lay purring herself to sleep in my lap, it was with a feeling of sadness I could not easily disguise. Then, at bedtime, when I retired with Mary to our quiet little chamber, where already my drawers were cleared out and my share of the bookcase was empty, and where hereafter she would have to sleep alone in dreary solitude, as she expressed it, my heart sunk more than ever. I felt as if I had been selfish and wrong to persist in leaving her, and when I knelt once more beside our little bed, I prayed for a blessing on her and on my parents more fervently than ever I had done before. To conceal my emotion, I buried my face in my hands, and they were presently bathed in tears. I perceived on rising that she had been crying too, but neither of us spoke, and in silence we betook ourselves to our repose, creeping more closely together from the consciousness that we were to part so soon. And the goodbye to a sister who has been a lifelong companion, right? And yes, that is something that she knows she will most likely never feel or experience again, that close contact with a sister, because they would become women. They were becoming women already, and they would each one have their own path, their own home, and separate. And that is painful, right? It really touches me. Well, I have a sister. I left home to pursue, let's say, adventures abroad and in other places, and it is bittersweet. But the morning brought a renewal of hope and spirits. I was to depart early, that the conveyance which took me, a gig hired from Mr. Smith, the draper, grocer, and tea dealer of the village, might return the same day. And a gig, if you're wondering, it's a light two-wheeled carriage drawn by one horse. I rose, washed, dressed, swallowed a hasty breakfast, received the fond embraces of my father, mother, and sister, kissed the cat to the great scandal of Sally, the maid, shook hands with her, mounted the gig, drew my veil over my face, and then, but not till then, burst into a flood of tears. Once you are alone, after she had kept the facade of being strong and independent and happy and eager, when she was alone, she crumbled. Here there is a footnote about the fact that kissing the cat scandalized the maid. While such behavior is not literally scandalous, this comment provides the first open acknowledgement in the novel of the typically strict protocol concerning personal relationships between classes during the Victorian era. Right? To kiss the cat would not be something appropriate for a lady to do, right? The gig rolled on. I looked back. My dear mother and sister were still standing at the door, looking after me and waving their adieu. I returned their salute and prayed God to bless them from my heart. We descended the hill, and I could see them no more. That's the threshold. Childhood is behind adulthood. The path towards to being mature begins now. It's a coldish morning for you, Miss Agnes, observed Smith, and a darksome one too. But we's happen get to yon spot afore there come much rain to signify. So this is a transcription of a sort of accent, which is hard for me to pronounce, of course. But here is the first of many instances of Bronte's use of the dialect of North England, which adds to the novel's realism. Anne and Emily Brontë also showed interest in linguistic matters in their diary papers, in which they often quoted their servants in dialect form. That is one of the difficulties the first time I read Wuthering Heights, is indeed understanding the dialect spoken by the servants at Wuthering Heights, especially because it's such an isolated rural area. So the way they spoke was even more primitive in a way. So it's hard to understand, right? Here it's all right, but please don't mind my pronunciation. Yes, I hope so, replied I as calmly as I could. Yeah, it's come a good sup last night too, which means that it rained quite a lot. Yes, but this cold wind will happen. Keep it off. Perhaps it will. Here ended our colloquy. We crossed the valley and began to ascend the opposite hill. As we were toiling up, I looked back again. There was the village spire and the old grey parsonage beyond it, basking in a slanting beam of sunshine. It was but a sickly ray, but the village and surrounding hills were all in sombre shade, and I hailed the wandering beam as a propitious omen to my home. With clasped hands, I fervently implored a blessing on its inhabitants and hastily turned away, for I saw the sunshine was departing, and I carefully avoided another glance, lest I should see it in gloomy shadow like the rest of the landscape. The way landscape is described by the Brontes is very telling. So what I call, and some critics call, emotional landscape. So here, her future, the unknown, what is ahead of her, is in shadows. When she looks back at her village, where her heart still is, it is light. It's the sun is shining there, and so she turns away because she does not want to see that place, her home, in shadows. She wants to keep that image, and that it's a good omen, she thinks, for the future of her family without her. And this is the end of chapter 1. So in chapter 1, we get to know the protagonist, her upbringing, where she comes from, her father, her mother, her sister, the history of her family, and the desire to know more of the world. The whole business failure with her father that led them to in need of more money. So she decides to find a way that she could help the family, since she cannot do anything pretty much. She has been spoiled by her family. She decides to leave to be a governess somewhere. And that's a bittersweet moment in her life, where she departs from childhood, from the security of her home, the love of her parents and sister, to the unknown. I hope you've enjoyed it so far, that you're interested in reading the rest with me, with us at Books and Culture. Next time, so next week, we'll read and discuss together chapters 2 and 3. And I'll see you then.